Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. It is April 28th, 2021, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing an author who is hot. Um, we have been talking about Shanghai for the last several months in so many different programs in our community. When we conjure up Shanghai, we think of a mega city, a mega cosmopolitan area, very modern. But now we're thinking of it as someplace that played a huge role in history and especially for the Jewish community over the years. I want to introduce Jonathan Kaplan, who's written a book that I don't know whether he created the moment or the moment was there for him to fill with his book. So, Jonathan, it's wonderful to have you as a guest on my show today.
Thank you, Sheila. I enjoy being here.
Okay, I want to tell people something about you before we get into the heart of your story about The Last Kings of Shanghai, the book that we're going to talk about. So we want to let everybody know that you are the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University. And before that, you had a stellar career in journalism as well as an author. You won the Pulitzer Prize working for Bloomberg News on, of all topics, I think was a corporate tax evasion or right, something like that, right? So you were in the financial world with Bloomberg and so many other things in journalism that you won awards for or were finalists for. But for our audience, I want them to know that you've also authored a couple of books that are important. One is The Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America. It won the National Jewish Book Award. And also A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. So you have a fantastic history. So let's start, Jonathan. Why the interest in Shanghai? How did it come to you? Because this book is, I'll say it again, it's hot. Everyone is looking at it.
Well, I think I'm a reporter, and so I think the way reporters do things like this is we often stumble upon interesting stories or interesting history. And so many years ago, back in the late 1970s, I was a foreign correspondent. I was just out of college. It was my first foreign assignment, and I was in China. And I went to Shanghai. And you have to remember, back then, in the late 1970s, it was still Red China. Everybody was wearing those blue Mao suits that we remember. There were far more bikes than cars. China was really very backward. It was as if time had stopped in 1949 when the communists took over. And so I was in Shanghai doing some reporting, and I had to go to the bathroom. And so I stepped into a hotel in downtown Shanghai along the Bund, which is that beautiful Art Deco waterfront. And it was like walking into a movie set from the 1930s. The floors were marble. There were these beautiful chandeliers, and a bellhop dressed all in white with a little white cap came up to me. And when I asked in English if there was a restroom that I could use, he responded to me in French. And so I kind of was trying to figure out what this place was, sort of in the middle of Red China, what this throwback to the 1930s was doing there. And someone said to me that it was a hotel that had been actually built by a wealthy Jewish playboy who was the richest man in Shanghai in the 1930s, and had built this huge palace of a hotel. So I kind of filed that away. Went on to my other reporting. And then about a year or two later, I was back in Shanghai again as a journalist. And I was taken to what was called the Children's Palace. This was a place where the Chinese said, well, this is where people bring their kids to go to take music lessons or ballet lessons during the school year. And so I thought it would be fun to go there, maybe write a nice feature story. And again, it was this incongruous site in the middle of Shanghai. It looked like an English country mansion, surrounded by beautiful lawns. I went inside, and it looked like it belonged to Downton Abbey or something. There were these beautiful staircases going up to the second floor. There were Chinese kids taking music lessons there, but clearly this had once been a grand home with a huge ballroom that a very rich family lived in. And as I left, I noticed there was a small plaque on the entrance, which said this had once been the home to the Kaduri family. Now, I knew the Kadoorie family because I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and the Kadoories were a Jewish family, probably one of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong, very influential, very powerful. But I hadn't realized that they had spent, many years, it turns out more than 150 years, living in China and living in Shanghai. So I filed that away. And then when I was based in China as the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, we moved to China. My whole family moved to China. My wife and I had 3 little kids at the time. And the kids loved Shanghai. They really loved visiting there. It was very adventurous for them to kind of explore around. And one weekend, as a family, we were exploring Shanghai, and we're going down some back roads and alleyways. And I noticed that in a lot of the tenement buildings, on the doorposts of the homes, there were these shadows of mezuzahs, which, not the mezuzahs themselves, those small objects that observant Jews often put on the entryways to their homes, but the shadow where they had once been nailed there. And again, I couldn't figure out, why would these be in the middle of Shanghai? There were no Jews in Shanghai. But it turned out during World War II, there had been Jews in Shanghai. 18,000 of them had fled the Nazis and had found refuge in Shanghai. So all these together kind of, had settled in my brain, and I decided I want to find out more about these extraordinary families, about the history of these families, but also what it says about China. As China has emerged as a world power, I wanted to understand how the pictures they carried around of the West and of these Jews who had shown up, and that was how my interest in the book started.
Wow, that's so interesting, and you just captured it so beautifully in your book. And we're going to talk about the various waves that came to Shanghai. You mentioned the third wave, the 18,000 or so Jews who fled Hitler and were able to come to Shanghai, an open city. But let's start in the beginning. Give us a little history of China and what it was like, how it opened up to exploration. And then, of course, you start your thing in the 1800s with the Sassoon family. Just give us a little summary of the Chinese history and where it stood at that time.
Sure. So China really, up until about 1835, 1840, was closed off from the rest of the world. The Chinese were a very advanced, very powerful country. But they had basically decided that they were better than everybody else and that there was no need to trade with other countries. Back then as now, even back in the 19th century, Western businessmen salivated at the idea of selling things to China. The British used to send trips to China, missions to China, where they would try to get China to open up to allow them to sell different products and so forth. Because it turned out the British really wanted to buy tea from China and other products, silk, things like that, that were very exotic and very much prized in Europe and in the rest of the world. But the Chinese really wanted to protect themselves from any kind of Western influence. So they were very isolated. And as it turned out, they also had become more and more technologically backward. While Europe had moved ahead in terms of improving their military technology and their ships and so forth, China had reached a high level, but had then stagnated pretty much. So there were many British companies that were urging the British government to invade China and open it up to trade. Because the one thing the Chinese did want to buy from Europe and from the Europeans was opium. China had a huge drug problem. Opium was grown in India. It was very addictive. And even though the Chinese tried to keep it out, British smugglers kept on bringing in opium and selling it on the black market. And they really wanted to have the market become open so they could sell it openly. So these British firms worked very hard, Jardine Matheson and others, and persuaded the British to invade China in what's called the Opium Wars in the 1840s. China went to war twice. The British won both times, the second time with even more European powers getting involved. And as a result, the Chinese had to open up all their cities to trade. They had to give up control over a lot of their cities, a lot of their laws, and that opened up kind of the ability for Western traders to go in, and that was the moment when, from the West view, China opened to the West. But when you talk to the Chinese, they talk about this as being the start of the 100 years of humiliation, when Western companies, Western countries, including the US, Britain, France, and others, kind of moved into China and established all these beachheads that, made China weak and pretty powerless.
Okay, so that's kind of the tableau when the Iraqi or Baghdadi Jews first come. Let's turn to some slides so that we can have some images to go with some of the discussion. Okay, here is The Last Kings of Shanghai by Jonathan Kaufman. So I want to show you there. You talked about it. Tell us about this photo, the Bund, and the importance of it. Jonathan, reading about your book and reading about Shanghai, I heard things like it was the Havana of the East or the Las Vegas of the East. Tell us about it in its heyday in this photo.
Right. Well, this is Shanghai in its heyday in the 1920s and 1930s. And there are a couple of things you can notice. One of them is this doesn't look like a typically Chinese scene, right? When we think of China, especially China several hundred years ago, or even, 100 years ago, we think of pagodas and rice paddies and so forth. But, this looks like a modern European city. And in fact, that's what Shanghai was. When China opened up, as I described, Shanghai suddenly became the financial center. And this part of Shanghai was actually occupied and run by the British. The French were nearby, the Americans came in. So when they were building up the buildings, they wanted buildings that looked like Paris or London or New York. And that's why Shanghai was always, in a way, the most modern city in China. One of the things also, and you can't really see it because, it's from a distance, Shanghai was the most cosmopolitan city in China. When you walked along the streets of Shanghai, of course, you would see many Chinese, but you would see British traders, you would see French, you would see all sorts of Americans there. It was a city really more like London and New York than it was like other cities in China. And this was the high point of sort of the Art Deco period. And as you can see, the architecture was really, really remarkable.
Now, on the extreme right, the building with the pointed facade, isn't that one of the hotels?
Yeah, that's the Peace Hotel. That's the hotel that I went into to use the bathroom many decades later. But this was a hotel that was built by Victor Sassoon. Victor Sassoon was a playboy. He was a member of the Sassoon family. He was extremely wealthy. And when he decided to move to Shanghai, he wanted to build a hotel that would rival any hotel in the world. And so he really built this kind of pleasure palace. He lived on the top floor. And as he bought up more and more buildings in Shanghai, became richer and richer, he sort of surveyed his empire from the top of that hotel, and would have extraordinary parties there. And it was the real center of Shanghai social life.
We'll talk more about Victor as we go along. And I have another photo of the hotel and how it is right now too. So let's go on. Oh, this is just another view of where did the name Bund come from? B-U-N-D.
The name Bund is actually an Indian name. Many of the initial traders to China, including the Sassoons and the Kaduris, the families I write about in The Last Kings of Shanghai, originally came from India. They were doing business there. They had settled there. And so when they came to Shanghai, they used the term Bund, which was a Hindu word that meant causeway, kind of along the water. So that's where that came from.
Okay. So now we get to the kings. And again, some of these images are so like royalty, exactly. So tell us about the first king that came to Shanghai in the 1800s.
Well, this is David Sassoon. And, I think when we think about Jewish history, we often think about Fiddler on the Roof, right? The stories of, poor Jews who grew up in ghettos in Europe or in Russia or the United States, and then gradually moved up and succeeded. But David Sassoon was actually from Baghdad. This was a place where the Jews actually, we read about them in the Bible. In the Bible, we read the psalm that says, "By the rivers of Babylon we wept when we thought of Zion." These were Jews who had been kidnapped from Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple and taken as captives to Babylon, which is Baghdad. Baghdad and Babylon are the same place. And there they kind of, as the Bible says, thought about returning to Jerusalem, but most of them never did because they had quite a good life in Baghdad. They became quite wealthy, quite influential. They established schools, and some of them became so prominent that they would regularly advise the rulers of Baghdad, becoming sort of like the treasury secretary. And David Sassoon was the head of the Sassoon family, the richest family in all of Baghdad. Now, his father had been what was called the kind of the prince of the captivity. When the head of the Sassoon family met with the rulers of Baghdad, he was carried through the streets in a sedan chair. People would bow their heads respectfully when he went by. And so David Sassoon's father was about to turn the dynasty over to David Sassoon, who we see in this picture. David Sassoon was about 37 when he was about to take over. But instead, what happened was that the politics of Baghdad turned against the Jews, and the government began kidnapping wealthy Jews and holding them for ransom. So David Sassoon's father realized that things were not going to go well for his family or his son. So he rescued David Sassoon and hustled him down to the waterfront, where he put him on a ship and sent him out to safety. But before he left, he took a cloak that had pearls and precious gems sewed inside and put it around his son's shoulders and sent him off. So this is David Sassoon. As you can see, has a tremendous, almost a royal bearing. He was very tall, but his early days leaving Baghdad were very hard. He was sleeping on the floors of warehouses. He was carrying a gun with him to shoot rats as they skittered on by. And he suddenly had to face a life without all the princely trappings that he had grown up with. He arrived in Bombay in India around the same time the British Empire was expanding. And so at that point, he decided to ally himself with the British. Even though he didn't speak any English, he gradually got his children, the rest of his family, out of Baghdad. They settled in Bombay, and he started turning them into proper Englishmen. He made sure that they learned English, that they studied English law, and even became British citizens, because he thought this was the best way to kind of reclaim the prominence and the influence that his family had long had in Baghdad, but which had been ripped away from them.
Yeah. So here he's celebrated. I guess this is one of the museums in India where
Right.
his statue is.
Yeah, well, David Sassoon became very quickly one of the wealthiest men in India. You know, even though he had had to flee Baghdad, he had been trained to run a global empire. He spoke several languages. He had a terrific head for business. And very quickly, he became one of the wealthiest men in India. And as you can see, began to build libraries and other institutes that would sort of, establish himself and his family as one of the leading families in the British Empire in India.
Right. And so now tell us about how he gets to Shanghai and who are these his sons?
Yeah, this is a wonderful picture, which I think captures exactly what is happening to the Sassoons at this time. David Sassoon had 8 sons. Here you see 3 of them, and you can see the transition that's taking place in the family. David Sassoon and the 2 sons on one side of him are still dressed as if they're living in Baghdad. His son on the other side is dressed as a proper British gentleman, because he understood that the future lay with being close to the British, being close to the British monarchy. And so the family was becoming well established in India. But then the question was, what was the next step? And after the Opium War, and after China opened up to trade, David Sassoon decided that there was a lot of money to be made in China. And so he took his 8 sons, these are 3 of them, but he took his 8 sons and essentially deployed them all throughout China. to open up kind of enterprises there to oversee the trade. The Sassoons begin to deal in opium. They're very successful at it. They make a great deal of money trading in opium. But at the same time, he also wants to establish a beachhead in London. So one of the sons, as you can see, Abdullah, changes his name to Albert. He dresses as a proper English gentleman. He goes to London and there starts establishing the Sassoon businesses there. So you can see wherever the Sassoons went, they were able to kind of acclimate themselves to the culture and become wealthier and wealthier and more influential.
Right. And as they did that, Jonathan, did they maintain the relics of their Jewish heritage? Were they observant? Did they create synagogues and other Jewish institutions where they went?
They did. In fact, when David Sassoon was sent his sons to China to establish his business beachheads, they always showed up with a clerk, several people to work with them, and they had trained the clerks how to keep kosher. And then they taught their Chinese servants how to keep kosher. And then David Sassoon began to build synagogues in Shanghai, as he had done in India. And then he was able to recruit other Jewish families in Baghdad and say, if you send your teenage sons, they were almost always sons, to work for me, I'll make sure that they have a synagogue to worship in, that they get medical care in a Jewish hospital, that they can even be buried in a Jewish cemetery. So they both kind of use their Judaism as part of their faith, which was very important, but it also created a sense of community. Remember, China was an extremely poor country. There was civil war, there was disease, no one spoke Chinese. And so having a Jewish community allowed people not to feel so lonely and to feel great loyalty to the Sassoons as they moved ahead in their business endeavors.
Right. So we've already mentioned earlier the third wave of Jews to Shanghai, those who were escaping the Holocaust from Germany and Austria, 1938 to 40. But there was another second wave after the Baghdadi Jews, and those were Jews mostly from the Russian Empire who were fleeing the Tsar, right, and persecution and pogroms there, who arrived in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, mostly, as we said, the Russian Jews. Lawrence Tribe, who was a guest at our program on refuge in Shanghai, was one of those whose family originated that way. Were the Sassoons and the other Baghdadi families in touch with or helpful to the Russian Jews as they arrived?
Well, it's interesting. The Baghdadi Jews really consider themselves, the Sassoons especially, to be the aristocracy, not only of the Jewish community, but of all of Shanghai. They very much wanted to be part of the British establishment. They had grand homes, grand mansions, as I described. And so when they looked at these other Jewish refugees arriving, whether it was the Russians arriving after the communists took over Russia or later the Jewish refugees, there was a little bit of disdain. They were sort of like the wealthy families seeing these new immigrants arrive. And, they might have given them some charity, might have protected them, but they didn't really want to socialize with them that much because they thought they were too low class. Now, when the World War II breaks out and the Jewish refugees are coming, pouring in from Europe by the thousands, I think there is a realization on the part of these wealthy families that no matter how wealthy they are, this is an existential crisis for the Jewish people. And the Sassoons and the Kaduris do step forward to help them. But I think, before that, there was this sense, as we often see in Jewish communities, that, there are class differences, which very much come to the fore, even in Shanghai.
Right. Not unlike the German American Jews who were here in the 1800s when the Eastern European Jews started coming to America in the 1880s.
Right. And
there was philanthropy, but also a distance. Right. Now, one of the things that you do in your book, Jonathan, so nicely is you highlight some women who were far ahead of their time in their accomplishments, in their business skills, we're going to get to it, journalism, writing, and so forth. So tell us about this woman. I think she's Flora, right? And
So,
how is she? How is she a Sassoon?
well, the women in these families are really extraordinary, and they're extraordinary in part because they never got the acknowledgement that they should have gotten. So, as I said, David Sassoon had 8 sons. He sends them eventually all around the world, but the sons also become infatuated in London. They make a great deal of money in China. And then they want to go to London where they can buy country houses and send their children to Oxford and Cambridge. And so there's always this concern about who's going to run the business. So one of the Sassoon sons remains behind in India running the business, but he dies prematurely. He dies very young. And Flora Sassoon basically steps forward and says, why don't I run the business temporarily until our son, who's a teenager at that point, comes of age and then takes things over. So her brothers-in-law basically say, well, okay, she's just a woman. This is in the late 1890s. Women, can't do very much. They don't have the right to vote. They're very much living a restricted life. So we'll let her run the company. But it turned out that Flora Sassoon was an extraordinary woman. She knew several languages. She was extremely well read. She had been tutored as a young woman in all sorts of areas. And she took over the Sassoon dynasty, essentially, in Bombay, running all their operations in India and China. Now, this was a time when not only women couldn't vote, but women in India had to live what was called behind purdah. And that meant they couldn't be seen in public. They were supposed to be, at home all the time, kind of overseen by their husbands. But Flora decides that she's going to break some of those rules. She begins to work running the company essentially from her living room. But then in kind of a scandalous moment, she goes out, she begins to visit the offices, she visits the Sassoon factories. In fact, at a moment, much like what we're going through now, there's a plague that breaks out in Bombay, and the bubonic plague. And many of the Sassoon workers are afraid to go to the factories because they're afraid they're going to catch the plague. And so Flora Sassoon decides to bring over scientists from Europe to search for a cure. They find a vaccine, and then Flora Sassoon basically has herself inoculated with the vaccine and has a picture taken of her with her bare arm getting the vaccine shot because she wants her workers to know that if she, this kind of wealthy woman, wealthy capitalist, is prepared to take the vaccine, it must be safe. And she really saves the company. But her brothers-in-law are jealous, and they begin to worry that she's not going to give up so easily when it comes time to give back control to them. So they essentially stage a kind of boardroom coup where they oust her from the company. She ends up sailing to England. She becomes a very well-known philanthropist in England and a very prominent scholar, but she never sets foot in the Sassoon businesses again. A friend of mine said, she kind of hits the bamboo ceiling. And that was not atypical for women at this time. They were extraordinarily gifted and had a great deal to offer, but even within their own families, they weren't allowed to thrive or to increase the various options before them. They were very restricted.
Yeah, all the more remarkable for what she did, And here she is again. And here is another one, Rachel Beer.
Rachel Sassoon Beers. So Rachel Sassoon Beers ended up being the editor of 2 newspapers in England, 2 of the leading newspapers, The Observer and The Times. This is at a time when women couldn't vote in England, but she was running 2 newspapers. Now, she got them in kind of a fairly conventional way at the time, which is that her husband bought the newspapers for her because she had an interest in writing, and he thought, this will amuse her if she gets to be the editor of these 2 papers. Maybe she would write a women's column or something on gardening. But it turned out Rachel had a very strong sense of politics. She was really a feminist before her time. She very much believed in not only the rights of women, but the rights of workers. She was very liberal. And so she used her position as editor to kind of advocate for these things. She wrote a number of outspoken columns favoring the development of pension systems, better working conditions for women and children. She even became very involved in the Dreyfus affair, where her newspapers exposed some key elements of anti-Semitism in the Dreyfus affair that ended up getting Dreyfus freed. Now, unfortunately, her husband died prematurely, and she fell into a depression. And today we probably would have said, well, she would get medication or some treatment and would be fine. But again, this was in the early 1900s, and her family essentially decided that she was unfit to run these newspapers, and they had her declared a lunatic and had her put in an asylum. She was eventually released, but she basically lived out the rest of her life in isolation in her mansion in London, and never kind of returned to the newspapers. And again, it's a tragedy of how a woman of such promise and passion and real fire, was unable to break the conventions of what was expected of women at the time.
Right, fascinating. She was a beautiful woman too. You can see there she is again from Auntie Rachel. Interesting.
And one thing you can see here is that the Sassoons were always seen as a bit exotic in London.
Uh-huh.
The fact that they'd come from Baghdad was something that they actually played up, because the British were fascinated. They were creating this empire around the world. And so when people like the Sassoons showed up, there was certainly anti-Semitism in Britain. And the Sassoons, despite their wealth, there was always a kind of social sniping going on, where people would make fun of them privately for being the hook-nosed Jews or the dirty traders and so forth. But they were also fascinated by the Sassoons, and so the Sassoons would buy these mansions in England, but they would invite the aristocracy over, including the Prince of Wales, who they became very close to, but they would serve Iraqi food. They would serve Middle Eastern food, which the British, thought was so exotic. So there was a way in which the Sassoons were very clever in terms of using their background to their advantage, as well as enduring some of the social snubs that came with being Jewish in British society.
Interesting. And now this guy, I mean, if you didn't know anything about your book or the history, you'd say, well, is he a Hollywood producer or actor, right? That's what he looks like.
This is Victor Sassoon. And as you can tell, he was, I guess, what would have been called a lady killer in his time. He was born in Europe, educated in London, and as you can imagine, was quite the playboy when he was a student at Cambridge University. He was always seen with, chorus girls, and he loved the glamorous life. But when he was in World War I, he was in a pilot. He was a pilot in World War I, and his plane crashed, and he became crippled. He lost the use of his legs. And at that point, he decided that he would not be able to have the kind of glorious high life that he had enjoyed up to then as a young man, and decided to go to Shanghai and India into the family business. And he essentially became really the sort of the center of social life in Shanghai. He was incredibly rich. He was probably the sixth richest man in the world. He was a brilliant investor. He was building all sorts of hotels and office buildings, beer factories. He really turned Shanghai into a modern city. But at the same time, he knew how to spend his money and knew how to enjoy it, as you can tell from this picture.
Yeah, there he is with Laurence Olivier. And is that Greer Garson? I'm not sure who the actress is. It looks like
So
Greer
what
Garson.
Dr. Sassoon did was he basically put Shanghai on the map as sort of the city on the grand tour you wanted to go to. Charlie Chaplin went to Shanghai to visit Victor Sassoon. Wallace Simpson, who would marry the King of England and make him leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai naked, except for wearing just a life jacket. Shanghai had this sense of glamour, but also naughtiness. And as you can see here, Victor was very much a ladies' man. He carried on all sorts of affairs with various starlets who came through, various people who lived in Shanghai. He was an incredible bon vivant. He would have these parties where everyone would have to dress up as a circus act, and he would be the ringmaster. They would dress up as school children, and he would be the schoolmaster. He really made Shanghai a place that everybody wanted to visit. And if you were rich and a celebrity, you wanted to hop on a cruise ship and stay at Victor Sassoon's hotels and go to his parties.
All right. So, Jonathan, tell us about the opium trade that helped to make the Sassoons and the Kadoris rich, and how that evolved over the years.
Well, as I say, when the British defeated China twice and opened up China to the opium trade, the Sassoons saw a great business opportunity. And two of the things that they realized immediately was that they could sort of use technology and innovation to their advantage. And so they invested very early on in steamships. Opium traditionally had been put on sailing ships in India, where it was grown, then put on sailing ships that sailed to China. It took several weeks, and then the opium would be sold there. Well, the Sassoons bought steamships, which allowed them to get their opium to market a lot faster. They also invested in this new technology called the telegraph, which allowed them to stay in touch with each other, with their family in India, and figure out what was a good time to sell the opium, what was a good time to hold it back until prices rose. They were so effective as businessmen that within 20 years, they had essentially driven everybody else out of the market. And the Sassoons, by 1870, controlled the opium trade completely. Now, when you talk to the Sassoons these days, when I interviewed the family, they said, well, look, it was like cigarettes, or it was like alcohol. It was a vice. The Chinese wanted this opium. There were many Chinese addicts. And so we were just taking advantage of a business opportunity. And that's true, but it's also true that the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. About 12% of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. The Sassoons themselves never used it. And the Sassoons, saw in their own company, they often had to dismiss Chinese employees who were addicted to opium, they couldn't work anymore. There were various movements to abolish the opium trade in England and in the US that the Sassoons fought tooth and nail. So I think there is kind of a moral culpability here that we have to recognize. I mean, I think it was Balzac who said, behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And for the Sassoons, that crime was opium. The Chinese communists, when they conquered Shanghai, seized the Sassoon business records and concluded, I saw the records, they concluded that the Sassoons probably made about $1 billion from the opium trade. And then they used that to buy a property and expand in Shanghai. But it certainly was money that they made by selling opium to the Chinese.
Sure, sure. Here's the Cafe Hotel, right? That was the
right. This is where you would go. So I like to say that right now we're all planning our post-pandemic trips where we're going to go, and if this were the 1920s or 1930s, we'd all be planning to go to Shanghai, because you could get, luxurious accommodations, you could stay in this beautiful hotel, but you'd also be in exotic China. And that was a pretty powerful combination. Yeah. It's true now, and it was even true in the 1920s and 1930s. So
is it called the Peace Hotel now? Is that what it's called?
Yes, now it's called the Peace Hotel. It was taken over by the communists in 1949 and really slipped into disrepair. But about 5 or 10 years ago, the Chinese decided to renovate it, and you can go there now, and you feel like you're stepping back in time. It's pretty plush and luxurious once again.
Yeah, we'll talk about later with the Kadoris, the Majestic Hotel that they had as a competition, but not really. Oh, and then another fascinating woman. I love reading about her and learning more about her, and the interesting affair that she had with Victor Sassoon, and at the same time with a Chinese gentleman. Tell
Right.
us about.
So Emily Hahn was a writer from the States. She became a writer for the New Yorker, very well known, and wrote a lot about China and a lot about Shanghai. She really loved the city, and her stories are really wonderful. They still hold up. So she and Victor Sassoon started having an affair soon after she arrived in Shanghai. But then she was pretty adventurous, and so she began having an affair with a left-wing Chinese writer who was pretty well known. And what's interesting is, she was having affairs with sort of these two kind of sides of Shanghai. Victor Sassoon, the successful capitalist living in his penthouse suite on the Bund, and then the Chinese leftist writer who was hanging out with the communists, Zhou Enlai and others, who were plotting revolution in Shanghai. That's very much what Shanghai was like. You had all these different forces contending there. And at one point, Emily Hahn was having lunch with Victor Sassoon in his nightclub. And she said, Victor, these communists, you got to take them seriously, because she had met them and she thought that the Chinese were beginning to gravitate towards the communists and the revolution. And Victor just dismissed her, said, that's not true. We have nothing to worry about. And it kind of gives you an insight into the sort of bubble that these wealthy Westerners lived in, where they couldn't see communism advancing. Even though Victor Sassoon was a brilliant businessman, he couldn't see what was about to happen, whereas Emily Hahn did. And of course, after World War II, when the communists seized Shanghai, the Sassoons end up losing almost everything because they didn't listen to what Emily Hahn was telling them.
Yeah, I read that. Victor, he had some foresight to leave China before he could get arrested after Pearl Harbor, right?
Right. He was able to get out in time, but he really couldn't sell his property until it was too late. And I think, it was interesting when he finally left China. He wrote that somebody interviewed him and he said, I didn't leave China, China left me. He sounded almost like a scorned lover, that China should have treated him better. And I think that was part of his kind of the way he looked at China. He felt that he was kind of almost royalty and that China had somehow betrayed him.
Right. Whereas, as we'll see as we get into it very quickly now, the Kadoris more accommodated to China, and we'll see that. So I just saw this last article from the New York Times. Emily Hahn at 73, still feisty and still writing, and I was comparing her to the two women, Flora Sassoon and Rachel, who didn't have such happy endings, and here Emily Hahn seems to have triumphed overall in the end too.
Yeah. Well, I think, frankly, the fact that she was an American, I think, made a huge difference. I think it was much harder if you were British and a woman, British and Jewish, British, from Iraq, to break through. And I think the fact that, America was more open, was an immigrant country, and, did have some room for women to kind of, carve out a role, allowed Emily Hahn to do that.
All right, now we turn to the competition family, the Kaduris. Tell us about them and their start.
Well, the Kaduris were also from Baghdad. They were distantly related to the Sassoons, but they weren't nearly as wealthy. They weren't nearly as prominent. And they had been doing well, except then the father died. And the mother was left with 7 children and was worried about how she would make do. And so she hit upon this idea of sending her son, Ellie, who's the one on the left, to go as a teenager to work for the Sassoons. So she sent Ellie, he was only 15 years old, sent him away from Baghdad to work for the Sassoons in Bombay. And the Sassoons were good to their word. They educated him, they trained him in business, and at 18 years old, they sent him to China to work in one of their offices north of Shanghai. Ellie was a smart young man, and he soon realized he could make a lot of money in Shanghai. He didn't really need the Sassoons. So he broke away from the Sassoons and started trading and doing business deals in Shanghai and Hong Kong. And by the time he was 30, was already a millionaire. and would become the founder of the Kaduri dynasty, which ended up being, when all was said and done, even wealthier than the Sassoons.
Interesting. And he had a wife who became legendary and very well memorialized, Laura.
Right.
Tell us about her.
So when Ali Kaduri, he was 30 years old, he was a millionaire, and as any, British man would do, or successful businessman would do at that point, he set sail for England to find a wife. And he got to London and met a very prominent Jewish family, the Makata family, that was sort of part of the Jewish aristocracy in London. They were quite well to do. And he met and fell in love with Laura. Now, Laura was an interesting woman. She actually was older than Ellie. And at the time, people were afraid that she was going to become a spinster, that she would never marry. She was very adventurous, very independent thinking. And the two of them fell in love and got married. Now, typically what would have happened, this was in the late 1890s, typically what would have happened was that Laura would have gotten pregnant. Ellie would have returned to Shanghai, made his fortune, and then come to visit London, every couple of times a year. But Laura instead announced that she wanted to accompany her husband to China, that she was going to go with him. And so she sailed with him back to Hong Kong. She swiftly had 2 children there. And then, in an even more extraordinary moment, announced she was going to travel across China with her husband as he did all his business deals. And so she gathered up her 2 children, some servants, and basically travels across China and keeps this extraordinary diary, which is sort of like reading The African Queen or something with Katharine Hepburn. Civil war is going on, there's starvation, there's famine. She's being pulled along in rickshaws through muddy streets. But she gets a real kind of front row seat to how poor China is and how deep the suffering is. And because of that, I think she becomes, in a way, the conscience of the Kaduri family. The Sassoons are off kind of making money and doing very well for themselves. But Laura begins to encourage her husband to help the Chinese, which is something very few Westerners were even thinking of doing. And she decides to focus on helping Chinese girls. She's convinced that it's Chinese girls need more education. And if they can get that, they will help lift the society up. And so she encourages her husband to set up these Kaduri schools for girls that will help Chinese girls, give them an education, help them break out of poverty. And I think, that is something that she's remembered for. But also, she and her husband settle down in Shanghai with their 2 boys in a mansion, and a fire breaks out at one point in the mansion. And Laura kind of runs out of the burning house, but she's convinced that the Chinese governess, the servant that she had hired to take care of her boys, is still in the house. And so she runs back inside to save her. Well, it turned out the governess had gone out through a different door. Laura is overcome by smoke and she dies in the fire. And that's a tragedy for the Kaduri family, of course, but it's even more of a tragedy. The Chinese look at it and can't quite believe that a wealthy British woman would risk her own life to save a Chinese servant. And I think that shows the impact that her kind of understanding of China and her care for the Chinese really had, both on the Chinese as well as on the future of the family.
Yeah, so interesting. Jonathan, in preparing for this, I tried to find other images of Laura, and this was the only one that I could find, which I thought was interesting. I'm going to keep searching. Do you have any other images of her besides this one?
This is sort of the story of women, really, in history, is that they're very often hidden. Their pictures weren't taken. Their diaries weren't kept. I was fortunate the family kept this diary. Women are often silenced, and so this is the only picture that we have, and thankfully we have it. But I think it's symbolic of the way in which it's hard to recover the stories of women, but when you do recover them, they're often extraordinary.
Yeah, interesting. And now here is Ellie with his 2 sons, and again they would become instrumental in the war effort and what the Kaduris and the Sassoons did for that 3rd wave of Jews. Tell us about it.
Well, so this is Elie Kaduri in the middle, the patriarch with his two sons, Lawrence and Horace. And as you can tell, this was very much a family business. After their mother died, the family went to London, but then Elie returned to Shanghai to kind of resume his business. And the boys were set in London. Lawrence, the one on the left, was going to be a lawyer. Horace, the one seated in the chair on the right, was going to go become an architect. And but then Elie Kaduri issued a command from Shanghai that the boys were supposed to come with him and work with him on the family business. And he basically kept them very close to him and very much under his thumb, even as they entered their 30s and 40s. Now, the Kaduris sensed that things were unstable in China. There was civil war in China. The Japanese had invaded China in the 1930s. They were advancing on Shanghai. And so the Kaduris began moving money out of Shanghai to Hong Kong. And they sent Lawrence Kaduri, one of the brothers, to Hong Kong to oversee that, while Elie and Horace stayed in Shanghai. But starting in the late 1930s, I had described how all these cruise ships were showing up in Shanghai with celebrities and Charlie Chaplin and rich folks kind of wanting to sample the excitement of Shanghai. But by the late 1930s, these cruise ships were also carrying Jewish refugees. The Nazis had taken power in Germany. They had annexed Austria. They were threatening all across Europe. And the Jews in these countries were desperate to get out, especially in Germany, especially in Berlin and Vienna. They were desperate to get out. But as we know, all across the world, countries had shut their doors. America had shut its doors. The European countries, they were all closed off. And so, but word spread throughout Europe that Shanghai, because it was in part occupied by the British and part by the Americans, part by the French, was essentially an open city. You didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai. So if you could get on a ship and could get to Shanghai, you would be safe. And so thousands of Jews kind of sell their belongings, often in Berlin and Vienna. These are middle-class Jews, professors, shopkeepers, merchants, lawyers, musicians, and they buy passage on these cruise ships with their families, and they start showing up in Shanghai. Now imagine, they've been in Berlin like a few weeks before. They come all dressed like they're going out for a walk in Vienna or Berlin. Shanghai is teeming with Chinese, there's poverty, there's disease, it's incredibly hot. Elie Kaduri, who we see in this picture, early on feels this loyalty to these Jews. He had been a Zionist, he was an observant Jew, and he really felt a tie to these refugees to help them, even though he had no relatives among them. And but he also realizes that Shanghai is going to be overwhelmed. They don't have any social services. How do you take in thousands of people who have nothing? And so he walked over to the Cafe Hotel, where Victor Sassoon sat in splendor in his beautiful suite. And, he confronted Victor Sassoon and he said, Victor, you're the richest man in Shanghai. You really have to step up. This is a crisis for our people. And Victor Sassoon, to his credit, does. And he opens up a lot of his buildings to these refugees. He employs them. For his part, Elie Kaduri funds programs for these Jewish refugees. Horace, his son, who's seated there, starts a school because many of these Jews are coming with their families, and they have no place for the children to go to school or to do anything. And so Horace Kaduri sets up a school. He hires teachers from the refugees who can teach in English, and they begin to educate a lot of the children. And so the Kaduris and the Sassoons really, it's almost like Schindler's List. I mean, they really establish an ability for these refugees to survive. And unlike in Europe, where the ghettos are these places where Jews are being killed and they're dying of starvation, life for these Jewish refugees is hard, but at least they have some freedom. They can send their children to school. Some study to become rabbis. And the miracle of the Second World War is that none of these Jewish refugees were killed in Shanghai. 18,000 of them, and they all survived, even though the Japanese were close allies of the Nazis.
Right. And the Japanese were supposed to listen to the Nazis and perform some kind of final solution for the Jews in Shanghai, but they did not. But instead, they did create the Shanghai Ghetto,
Right.
where many Jews
Ghetto,
would
right.
come in.
It was conditions there were hard, but it's not like the Warsaw Ghetto or the ghettos in Europe, which were essentially camps where, Jews were being killed and they couldn't get out. The Shanghai Ghetto was, there was hunger, the living conditions were terrible, but frankly, after the war ended and the Jews kind of found out, the Jews in Shanghai discovered what had happened to their relatives in Europe, they realized how lucky they had been.
Exactly. I read so many stories that they were thinking that they were just temporarily in Shanghai and were going to go back to Germany or Austria, and the heartbreak that they realized when the war was over and learned that they had no home to go back to. Yes. Uh, the Kaduris had the competition hotel, the Majestic Hotel, but I read in your book and other places that it did not hold a candle to the cafe. Is that true?
That's true. The Kaduris built this hotel. It was beautiful, but Victor Sassoon built an even more beautiful hotel. And the way economics works, guests started, Charlie Chaplin and others started staying in Victor Sassoon's hotel, and actually Victor Sassoon ended up buying this hotel from the Kaduris and then knocked it down so he wouldn't have the competition. He was quite a ruthless businessman when he wanted to be.
And then we read about all kinds of fancy balls and occasions being held at the ballroom in the Majestic Hotel.
Right. And I think this again is a sense of the glamour. But one thing I want to emphasize is this was a glamour that wasn't just for Westerners or Europeans. Both the Kaduris and the Sassoons kind of broke with the mores of the time by inviting Chinese to these parties and to dance in their hotels and to stay there. It was really a place where wealthy upper middle class Chinese began to get a glimpse of the West and what the West was like. It was kind of a meeting point of these two cultures, and so in that sense, the Kaduris and the Sassoons were very much ahead of their time and contributed to the sense of Shanghai as a true international city.
Right. And I think this was the Marble House. Was this the Kaduri
This was,
home?
this was where the Kaduris lived, 43 rooms for 3 people with 44 servants. That's how you could live in Shanghai if you were a wealthy member of these families.
And here are the two brothers again.
Right. And the two brothers after the war. So Victor Sassoon was able to escape from Shanghai right before Pearl Harbor, but the Kaduris were not as fortunate. They ended up being trapped in Hong Kong and Shanghai and were put under arrest by the Japanese. And Elie Kaduri, the patriarch, actually died in Japanese captivity, and the empire passed over to the two brothers, who, as you can see, were now, fully grown adults. They were in their 40s and 50s. Now, Victor Sassoon left Shanghai after the communists took over, never returned, and felt betrayed like a scorned lover. The Kaduris, in a way, were turned out to be far smarter. They went to Hong Kong, believing that one day China would open up again, and they rebuilt their fortune in Hong Kong and became richer than ever. The Kaduris today are worth $13 billion. They're the richest Western family in China. Horace Kaduri became a philanthropist and helped hundreds of thousands of Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. Lawrence Kaduri, the man you see here, became the business head of the family, expanded their holdings throughout Hong Kong, and then became a key advisor to the Chinese government. When China opened up again in the 70s, Beijing reached out to the Kaduris, and Lawrence Kaduri, you see here, met with Deng Xiaoping. The Kaduris have met with every Chinese leader since. They've managed to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in China, and they're still in Hong Kong today. So their story had this second chapter, which is after Shanghai fell, they were able to rebuild bigger than ever in Hong Kong.
Right. Essentially, they supported the Chinese government against the Tiananmen Square massacre too.
Right. I think, whatever their personal feelings were, they always insisted that, they would not go against China publicly because they believed that China, that was part of the world, would be stronger and that they would, of course, profit more the more business that China did. And that turned out to be true, although now I think it's a very complex time for them because, China is cracking down in Hong Kong. And I think there are members of the Kadoorie family that worry, will this be Shanghai again? Will they have to flee? No one knows how it's going to play out. But it is true that for now, the Kadoories are walking a tightrope and supporting the government, but it's unclear how things are going to shake out.
And of course, Dr. Feng Shang-ho was one of the diplomats in Europe who handed out permission papers for many thousands of Jews to get on those cruise ships and go to Shanghai.
Right. And he was someone who he had grown up in the countryside, but when he came to Shanghai, he kind of became more aware of the wider world, um, understood there were actually Jews out there. And then he was posted as a diplomat for the nationalist government in Vienna and in Munich and got to know some Jewish families. And so when Hitler occupied Vienna and these Jewish families were terrified, he realized that if he gave them these kind of slips of paper that he called visas, that would be enough to get them out of Vienna and to safety in Shanghai. And he helped save thousands of Jews, kind of getting them out of Europe. And then by the time they got to Shanghai, the Kadoories and the Sassoons were there waiting to help.
Right. He's in the Grove of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, I
Right.
should say. And here's someone who tangled with Victor Sassoon, right?
Yeah, this is Victor Inuzuka. This is a Captain Inuzuka. He was a Japanese captain, an anti-Semite, who was put in charge of the Jewish problem in Shanghai. But what was interesting was that while the Japanese were anti-Semitic and believed that Jews controlled the world and controlled the world economy, and believed that Victor Sassoon was enormously influential and could get Churchill or Roosevelt to do what he wanted, they also believed that if you could get the Jews on their side, that they would help them. And so Captain Inuzuka would meet with Victor Sassoon, and Victor Sassoon could be a charming man. And Victor Sassoon said to him, look, come to my nightclub, have your soldiers, use my hospitality. At the same time, Victor Sassoon was spying on the Japanese. Victor Sassoon himself would fly to South America trying to buy land where these refugees might be resettled. But he kind of persuaded Inuzuka that he might use his influence to keep America out of the war or to keep Churchill out of the war. And so Inuzuka was willing to continue to allow these refugees to come into Shanghai. It was almost like a con game that Victor Sassoon ran. Ironically, because Inuzuka allowed so many Jews to settle in Shanghai, the Americans arrested him as a war criminal after the war, but many Jews came to his defense and said, he protected us. He allowed us to come to Shanghai. And as a result, he was not tried for war crimes. He lived out his life in Tokyo. And in his apartment, he would keep a picture of himself and Victor Sassoon at the Cathay Hotel. So history plays some odd tricks sometimes.
So there were turbulent years for Jews in Shanghai. 37, the Japanese took over. 41, Pearl Harbor. 43, the ghetto was created. And then, of course, there were bombings, and some hundreds of Jews were killed in some of the American Allied bombing. And then, of course, you've got this photo from your book, Jonathan. Was this Liberation Day in 1945 in Shanghai?
Right. The Americans liberated Shanghai. And they really didn't know what to expect, and then kind of stumbled across, these prisoners and people in prison camps and people in the Shanghai ghetto. And you can see there was very little food. Conditions were very hard. But one of the things that was so poignant is, as you suggested earlier, as the Americans began to tell the refugees what had happened in Europe, the towns that had been destroyed, how all the Jews had been killed, the Jews in Shanghai realized how lucky they were, but they also had to rebuild their lives. And so the the Jewish refugees ended up going to Palestine, to the States, South America, Australia, but they couldn't go back home to Europe because everything they had known back in Berlin, Vienna, had been destroyed.
Right. So here is our final slide, and there it is, 1949, the Chinese communists marching into Shanghai. After that, most Jews left, isn't that right? There were very few Jews left in Shanghai.
Right. As you say, the Jews had always thought they were going to be there temporarily. They had ended up in Shanghai because it was the only place that would take them in. And so they left. Victor Sassoon left. He had lost almost everything. The communists took over and nationalized all his businesses. The Kaduris left, went to Hong Kong and had to rebuild. And the Jewish refugees left and decided to start their lives elsewhere. But they carried a great deal of affection, I think, for the Chinese. When you talk to the refugees and their families, they remember how the Chinese, ordinary Chinese, were kind to them. They treated them well, even though they didn't speak German or English and the refugees didn't speak any Chinese, that the ordinary Chinese would share their food, they would give their children rickshaw rides. There was really a humanitarian connection between the two. And I think you see that today when you go to China and say that you're Jewish. The Chinese are fascinated by that, and they want to find out more about the Jews. And I think they're proud of this history when, even though they were poor and occupied by the Japanese, they were able to give refuge to these people who were fleeing Hitler.
And there's a museum for the Jewish refugees in Shanghai. There's a museum in Shanghai that has a lot of the artifacts and the history. Have you visited that museum?
I've been there several times, and it's really worth putting on your itinerary if you go to Shanghai. And in fact, more and more in Shanghai, the Peace Hotel, which is the old Cathay Hotel, has several exhibits about Victor Sassoon. The Kaduris have a hotel again on the Bund. I think China is kind of in this, pull between the nationalism that we see in China, the increasing repression, but also a kind of recognition of their more cosmopolitan and interesting history. And so going to China and following this history from the 1920s and 1930s is interesting, and I think, gives us some sense of how the Chinese see themselves.
Yeah. So have you been surprised by the tremendous outpouring of response to your book? And have you had some surprises that you didn't expect?
Well, yeah, I think in a way, what's been most surprising is the international interest in it. The book's going to be coming out in Chinese. It'll be coming out in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Korea, in Vietnam. It's really remarkable. There seems to be a fascination with this story. And I guess I do feel for myself, one of the things I like about this book is that, it is a story about China. It is a story about, business, but it's also a story about families. And you see through these two families how, brothers got along or didn't get along, how wives struggled against their husbands, how fathers and mothers tried to deal with their children surrounded by history. In other words, we don't get to choose the moment of history we live in. And one of the things you see with these families is over and over again, they're facing these moral choices. Do we deal with opium or don't we? Do we go to China or don't we? Do we stand up against Hitler and protect the refugees or don't we? And I think that's resonant for people because, as we know, we live in a time of very difficult moral choices ourselves. And someday, 50 years from now, someone may be writing our story and they may be asking some of the same questions that we're asking of the Sassoons and the Kaduris, right, and the time of history that they lived through.
I think there are two things that are so attractive and important in your book. One is the hitherto not necessarily untold, but not as well known story about Jews seeking refuge in Shanghai during World War II and before. And secondly, how in the diaspora, how our Jewish community has been so diverse, accommodated to the various cultures of the nations in which they've lived, but also made huge contributions while still keeping their basic Jewish traditions and philosophies and ways of life. Can you comment on that? Because I think to me that is also one of the important
Right.
stories.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that on the one hand, seeing the way Jews have maintained their traditions is important. But I think seeing the way Jews have reshaped the places that they've been in, I think Shanghai would not be Shanghai were it not for these families. In the same way, we can look at America and say, if Jews hadn't been active in the civil rights movement, history might have been different. The same way we can look at Europe and say, if Jews hadn't been involved there, history would have been different. I think we see in these stories how interrelated the world is and how much, crossing over there is. And I think that's something, as I'm Jewish myself, is something that I enjoy, that you can both be Jewish, but your Jewish values can also inform how you deal with the rest of the world. And I think that makes the world a richer and more interesting place.
Okay, great. I think this is a great place to end our discussion. It's been wonderful having you. And please, everyone, The Last Kings of Shanghai by Jonathan Kaufman. It's a book that you'll enjoy. You'll be enlightened, and you won't be alone because so many people are enjoying it. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone, for listening. See you next time on Talk Back. Bye.